Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we'll talk about my Week 2 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'll be mentioning my top 36 ranked wide receivers, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, along with presenting statistics that currently justify these players' rankings as we approach Week 2. Additionally, we'll talk about the wide receiver position in regards to matchups, which overall wide receivers have the most advantageous matchups going into the week, because the defenders on the opposite side of the field certainly play an overall impact on the potential successes or failures of our wide receiver prospects going into a given matchup. Before we get into all that, a reminder, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season for the singular purpose of trying to help you capture a fantasy football championship. So if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button. Help us get to 80,000 subscribers. I appreciate the support. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about wide receiver matchups for Week 2 of the 2023 fantasy football season. I've gone ahead and compiled fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers thus far this season in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, the Los Angeles Chargers secondary gave up the most points to opposing wide receivers in Week 1, 66 fantasy points, of course, all highlighted by the efforts of someone like Tyreek Hill putting up an incredible performance. Nonetheless, this is only 1 week of performances. As we progress throughout the season, I'll continue to add statistics to these overall averages, and we'll get a better understanding as to which matchups we can truly take advantage of. That being said, we know that J.C. Jackson, the primary cornerback of the Los Angeles Chargers, ever since he's joined the Los Angeles Chargers, formerly of the New England Patriots, he has not played well, whether it was prior to the injury last season or even after. He has not performed well for this organization. DeAndre Hopkins could have himself a great matchup on hand. The second best matchup, the Tennessee Titans, of course, they were awful all of last season. It really isn't much of a surprise that their secondary is getting picked on once again, primarily because they're so great in terms of stopping the run. Majority of teams only have one option, and that's to pass the ball on them. It'll definitely bode well for Chargers wide receivers, whether that is a Keenan Allen or a Mike Williams going into the week. Either way, I want to present these statistics, but on the other side of the coin, there are certainly tougher matchups. Now, in some of these circumstances, for example, the Carolina Panthers, the Atlanta Falcons did not complete a pass to their number one wide receiver, Drake London. The only wide receiver for that team that caught a pass was Mac Hollins. So just putting into perspective, some of these statistics are very much so skewed because of what happened in Week 1. We typically want to take advantage of the secondaries that really haven't played well. Oftentimes we'll look towards secondaries, in specific a singular cornerback that is really good in terms of their overall coverage. But as we progress throughout today's video, we'll talk about zone versus man coverage, certain looks that these wide receivers are going to see going into the given week, which injuries potentially in the secondary are going to impact some of these players and give them an even heightened level in terms of fantasy success going into Week 2. With that all covered, let's get into talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings. Again, for those of you who want more rankings than just my top 36 wide receivers, you want my top 32 quarterbacks, top 60 running backs, top 80 wide receivers, top 100 plus flex going into every single week, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get a first-time deposit match up to $100, you're additionally going to get my rankings sent from my email to yours every single Sunday morning, which includes rankings by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex. Many of the content pieces that are not offered on the channel in terms of the weekly videos is all presented to you on Sunday morning. So regardless of what you're doing, you can set yourself up for success. For those of you who want those kind of advantages and of course want to take advantage of the opportunity on hand via Underdog Fantasy, be sure to check out whether you're eligible on the right side of the screen based on your current location, your age. Thank you very much. Of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy, and also take advantage of their specific pick'em plays. As of this week, we have the 100K Sunday. You got to go ahead, put Tua Tagovailoa in a pick'em slip, get it accurately, and once you go ahead and accurately succeed in that overall pick'em slip, you have a chance of winning $10,000. So go ahead, take advantage of the opportunity on hand. Last thing I wanted to mention before we continue, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to check out the merch via the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel, the 1.01 brand. If you guys haven't checked out the link, there's a link down in the description to continue to support the channel with high quality, stylish, and comfortable clothing for your most stressful fantasy football Sundays for the 2023 season. So check that out. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about the wide receiver position, beginning with our number one. It is Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. Even though Tyreek Hill is coming off an incredible week, we got to mention Ja'Marr Chase first and foremost because of the matchup that he has on hand. He takes on the Baltimore Ravens secondary. First and foremost, when you look at week 18 of the 2022 season and how well Ja'Marr Chase performed against that defense, 8 catches, 86 yards and a touchdown, 18.6 fantasy points. We had the wild card game against the Baltimore Ravens in which he had 9 catches, 84 and a touchdown, 18.9 fantasy points. And I thought to myself, well, he's performed well against them as of late. What about the history of success for Ja'Marr Chase throughout his career? In 4 out of the last 5 games against the Baltimore Ravens, he has scored 16 or more half PPR fantasy points against the Baltimore Ravens secondary. As of this week, Marlon Humphrey has a chance of missing this game. Additionally, Marcus Williams, one of their safeties, has a torn pec. Their secondary is already in trouble. A lot of injuries continue to plague the Baltimore Ravens every single season. It's going to be difficult to run the ball on the front 7 of the Baltimore Ravens, as it typically is. Roquan Smith in the middle of that defense certainly makes it very difficult for Joe Mixon to find any success there. I believe there's going to be a huge bounce back from Joe Burrow and, of course, his number 1 receiving option, Ja'Marr Chase. Number 2 is Justin Jefferson going into the week. Justin Jefferson has a short week, takes on the Philadelphia Eagles on Thursday night. Again, last season, week 2, had a Monday Night Football game against the Philadelphia Eagles, and it wasn't the best overall performance from Justin Jefferson last season. 12 targets, 6 catches, 48 yards, and only 7.8 fantasy points as a whole. The opportunities were there, just like it was last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where he had 12 targets, 9 catches, 150 receiving yards. But unfortunately, Kirk Cousins brought down his overall potential level in that week 2 performance last season against the Philadelphia Eagles, where Kirk Cousins unfortunately threw 3 interceptions throughout that game. That being said, the Philadelphia Eagles defense typically plays zone coverage with their secondary about 2/3 of the time. Therefore, if in fact James Bradberry is going to miss the game, there's a lot of potential in which Darius Slay is not on the same side of the field as Justin Jefferson. And if that ends up being the case, Justin Jefferson on Sunday against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 6 catches, 81 receiving yards against zone coverage. He always finds himself a lot of success regardless of whether it's man or zone. I'm expecting Justin Jefferson to have a huge week, primarily because the rushing game isn't going to be as successful against this Philadelphia Eagles front 7. And on top of it, it's going to be up to Kirk Cousins getting them out of those 3rd and long situations with Justin Jefferson for a majority of that game. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about Tyreek Hill, our number 3. Even though Tyreek Hill is coming off a 39-point fantasy week, he takes on the New England Patriots. And though he has found success throughout his entire career against the secondary, last season in specific with Tua under center, 14 fantasy points in the week 1 contest against New England. Week 17, even with Skylar Thompson as their starting quarterback, 13.7 fantasy points in that overall week. Tyreek Hill is an automatic start every single contest. I just truly do believe Bill Belichick is going to have a plan set in place in order to try to bottle him up as much as possible. Even with that being the case, he's far too talented. Tua Tagovailoa going up against Bill Belichick. This will be the 5th time in his career. Prior to this matchup, Tua is undefeated as a starter against the Patriots. Therefore, I'm expecting another huge week for Tyreek Hill and the boys down in Miami. Moving on to Stefon Diggs, our number 4. Stefon Diggs had himself a far greater performance than I anticipated going up against that secondary. Now, that offense was slow to start, but eventually they found their rhythm. Unfortunately, Josh Allen never really found a rhythm in that game until the final 2 minutes. And even then, he turned over the ball 3 times through the air and once on the ground. If, in fact, you don't turn over the ball in those 4 overall drives, imagine the amount of fantasy value is going to be tacked onto Stefon Diggs given week. Taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, who have a terrible secondary, specifically in terms of cornerbacks coverage, I expect Stefon Diggs and, of course, Josh Allen to have themselves another big week here. Josh Allen, with a bounce-back week with a lot to prove, should have himself a fantastic week. Let's not forget, last season, from weeks 1 through 8 of the 2022 fantasy football season, in a half PPR scoring format, prior to Josh Allen's injury, Stefon Diggs was the number 1 overall wide receiver, averaging 20.84 fantasy points per game. Coming out with a huge performance in week 1 isn't much of a surprise. Our number 5 for this week is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown, taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Amon-Ra St. Brown, in the last 21 healthy games he has played in his career, 19 of those games consist of 6 or more receptions. Obviously was able to accomplish that against the Kansas City Chiefs. The fact that they continue to give him high levels of opportunity, he delivers on a weekly basis, and now they're giving him more red zone utilization. That is the key to unlocking his potential upside within a given year. Again, this is an offense that is often going to reach the red zone. And if they can get there, continue to look in the direction of their number 1 receiving option in Amon-Ra St. Brown, his potential continues to grow, and his upside, on top of the base floor of production that he has at such high levels every single week, Amon-Ra St. Brown can absolutely be a top 5 wide receiver rest of the season. He takes on the Seattle Seahawks, like I mentioned earlier. Puka Nacua, the rookie wide receiver of the Los Angeles Rams, on top of Tutu Atwell. Both of these guys torched this defense. Both of them each had 114 receiving yards, but Puka Nacua, whether he was playing out wide, whether in the slot position, had himself 10 receptions. If Matthew Stafford and the Los Angeles Rams can do that to this defense, specifically without Cooper Kupp, I can only imagine what someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be able to do in terms of cutting up this defense and their coverage. Our number 6 for this week is A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown had himself a pretty solid week, even though he didn't find the end zone, which we want to see him do on a consistent basis. 10 total targets is an incredible number. That's 30% of the overall target share within this offense. And the fact that this, running game hasn't really been reliable, despite the fact that you have talented players there, an inactive Rashad Penny and very little utilization of DeAndre Swift and Kenneth Gainwell out there makes it quite ineffective in terms of the yard per carry upside that we saw from guys like Miles Sanders in the past. I mean, Miles Sanders was averaging 5 yards per carry within this organization. So if they're going to have to continue to lean upon throwing the ball, it's only going to help these receivers. This week they take on the Minnesota Vikings Thursday night. Week 2 of last season against this defense, 5 catches, 69 yards, 9.4 fantasy points. I'm hoping for similar utilization in terms of the target share for A.J. Brown. And with that opportunity, he's absolutely going to be able to deliver, primarily because you look at the secondary. Last week, Mike Evans, 6 catches, 66 yards, and a touchdown. That's pretty much the same kind of player that A.J. Brown is. I just think A.J. Brown, at this point of his career, a far better receiver in comparison to the older Mike Evans. Number 7, we have CeeDee Lamb taking on the New York Jets defense. Now, last week, I worried about Stefon Diggs and, of course, Sauce Gardner, pretty much matching him in coverage. Now, that wasn't the case for majority of the game. Therefore, Stefon Diggs found himself a lot of advantageous overall positions. So going into this week, if CeeDee Lamb is going to be far away from a guy like Sauce Gardner, and even if he does line up against him, he's a talented enough wide receiver to be able to put up a great performance. Now, last week, his overall performance of 4 catches, 77 receiving yards, had himself a singular reception of 49 yards. Primarily, they didn't need to throw the ball in that game. They were already up 19-0 before the first rushing touchdown or offensive touchdown of the game. Therefore, I'm of the belief that CeeDee Lamb will get himself far more utilization. We know that Brandon Cooks did not participate in practice earlier today. It is Wednesday. He could end up participating by Friday and active, but if he's not, we know the de facto number 1 wide receiver of this offense certainly has a lot of upside. Number 8 is Calvin Ridley. Man, did Calvin Ridley have himself an incredible performance. If it wasn't for the fact that he stepped out of bounds just barely, this man would have had himself 2 receiving touchdowns and another 20 additional yards on his overall score line. Had himself 20.1 fantasy points, 11 targets, 8 catches, 101 and a touchdown. This is the premier Calvin Ridley that we saw back in 2020, where he was dominating with the Atlanta Falcons and Matt Ryan. And now that you have an even better offense, a young quarterback gunslinger that is not afraid to throw the ball, we're in a position where going up against the Kansas City Chiefs this week, we should find ourselves a lot of success. In the 2 matchups in which the Jacksonville Jaguars took on Kansas City last year, once in the regular season and once in the NFL playoffs, we found that the wide receiver position in those games, they scored 43.5 fantasy points and 29.6 fantasy points. In terms of statistics, 21 catches, 210 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns in the first matchup. In the following matchup in the playoffs, 15 receptions, 161 and a touchdown. Going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, I'm hoping for a shootout. Our number 9 for this week is Davante Adams. Now, it is very promising to see how well Jimmy Garoppolo played overall. In terms of his efficiency, a 77% passing completion percentage is beautiful. I mean, in comparison to what Jimmy Garoppolo has done in the past, we have seen him be kind of protected, and the scheme of the San Francisco 49ers really prevent him from accelerating his overall passing statistics. Now, within this offense, they're probably going to continue to protect him, but if he's going to be as efficient as he was last week, and the fact that we did see him complete 2 passing touchdowns, unfortunately, they went in the direction of Jacoby Myers in comparison to those of us who have Davante Adams on roster. Again, Jacoby Myers had himself 3 red zone targets. Davante Adams had himself 1. Those numbers are going to even out as the weeks progress. Therefore, I'm not too worried about it. Takes on the Buffalo Bills this week. Should be a game in which they run the ball heavy, and if and when they do, the play action game will open up for Davante Adams down the field. Number 10 is Chris Olave. Chris Olave had himself a great week 1. 15.2 fantasy points, led the team in total targets, 8 receptions, 112 through the air. The overall relationship from Derek Carr to Chris Olave that we were hoping to see in 2023 is beginning to, build a lot of momentum so far just from week 1's performance. Now, this upcoming week, they do take on the Carolina Panthers. It is a division rival. It should be an easier matchup considering the fact that the Carolina Panthers offense with Bryce Young, it's still going to be slow to start. So even if we're in a situation where Derek Carr and this offense aren't able to score immediately, they're going to be throwing for a lot of this game. Chris Olave, in the last 2 matchups in which he took on the Carolina Panthers last season, in one of those games, 19.2 fantasy points. In the other, 12.5 fantasy points. In both those games, was able to surpass 60 receiving yards. I'm hoping for a big game here against the Carolina Panthers secondary, which may not have J.C. Horn based on the injury he sustained last week. Number 11 is Deebo Samuel, the thumbnail of today's episode. Those of you may have been wondering, man, why is Deebo Samuel on the thumbnail when Brandon Aiyuk had himself such a major week last week? Well, here's the fact of the matter. There are so many elite threats within this offense, whether it is Brandon Aiyuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, and Christian McCaffrey, that any single one of these players in a given week can have that huge 25-point fantasy week. Therefore, I truly do believe going into this week, it's going to be Deebo Samuel based on the matchup on hand against the LA Rams, their division rival. In the last 5 games that Deebo Samuel has played against the LA Rams since 2020, in the regular season, he is averaging 21.85 fantasy points per game. In those games, 20.7, 27.8, 26.96, 15.0, and 18.8. Not a single game in the regular season since 2020 of less than 15 fantasy points against the LA Rams. In 4 out of those 5 games, over 113 total yards. In 4 out of those 5 games, at least 1 touchdown minimum. Deebo Samuel, he just shows up for Rams games. He wants to dominate against his division rival. Should be a fun week for him. Number 12 is DeVonta Smith. I think DeVonta Smith could very easily be in the B tier, especially considering his target share. This last week against the New England Patriots, 10 total targets, identical to A.J. Brown. That's a 30% target share within the offense. And if, in fact, like I mentioned with A.J. Brown, this rushing attack is not going to have Kenneth Gainwell on Thursday night, and we're going to see Rashad Penny and DeAndre Swift split potential touches with Boston Scott, we may not have as effective of a running game as we potentially desire, primarily because even though this is a great offensive line, additionally, the run-stop defense of the Minnesota Vikings, they're well improved this offseason, and they've already demonstrated that in their Week 1 efforts. Therefore, DeVonta Smith, A.J. Brown, the entire passing attack should be able to dominate. Last year, in the Week 2 matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, 7 catches on 7 targets, 80 receiving yards, 11.5 fantasy points. I'm hoping for more upside and potentially finding himself in the end zone this week. Number 13 is Jaylen Waddle. Now, unfortunately for Jaylen Waddle, he's going to be overshadowed by all of the efforts of Tyreek Hill. Having a 39-point week in comparison to Jaylen Waddle's 9.8 fantasy points, I mean, obviously deserves being overshadowed. Nonetheless, I truly do believe that we got to keep an eye on Jaylen Waddle because he is going to have himself one of these breakout performances similar to the way he did early last season. And an opportunity taking on the New England Patriots, while they'll be so highly focused on stopping someone like Tyreek Hill and bottling him up, it could open up more opportunities for Jaylen Waddle. In the last 3 games in his career in which he's taken on this defense, the New England Patriots, with Tua Tagovailoa starting and healthy, he's put up 15.7, 11.2, and 14.1 fantasy points. There is a lot of potential for Jaylen Waddle in the slot position to dominate and cut up this defense. Moving on to Keenan Allen. Speaking of slot wide receivers, they take on the Tennessee Titans. Last week, of course, we saw a lot of opportunity go in the direction of Keenan Allen, and he just barely missed out on a touchdown. In fact, originally they had deemed it a receiving touchdown. They went ahead, they replayed it. They said he didn't break the plane. Unfortunately, 2 plays later, Donald Parham catches that touchdown. We could have had himself a huge week from Keenan Allen. Nonetheless, again, those opportunities are going to slip, but the fact that he had 9 targets, 6 catches, 76 yards is great. Last season, he did have the privilege of taking on the Tennessee Titans secondary. Again, this is going to be an advantageous matchup. In that game, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 86 receiving yards. In that game also, Justin Herbert threw the ball 42 times, primarily because the rushing game against that defense often doesn't really find success. Therefore, you're going to have to throw the ball a bunch. And if that's going to be the case, the number 1 receiving option of the Los Angeles Chargers should find themselves a lot of success, hopefully finding themselves also in the end zone. Number 15 is DK Metcalf. Now, DK Metcalf had himself a solid week, 12.2 fantasy points. But the reality of the situation is that the last reception that DK Metcalf had in that game was the receiving touchdown with 9 minutes and 21 seconds left in the second quarter. That means DK Metcalf did not have a single reception in the entirety of the second half of that game. And it wasn't even just him. Tyler Lockett didn't have a single reception in the entirety of the second half of that game. That was not the offense for the Seattle Seahawks that we are accustomed to and the efforts of Geno Smith that he presented to us last year. And quite frankly, I think that was just kind of a game that we can just throw away. Let it roll down our backs and just continue to believe that this offense is far better than what they demonstrated against the Los Angeles Rams. Ultimately, of course, the game got out of hand after a while. And with that, you know, we saw a chippy DK Metcalf. He wants to win. He wants to be competitive. And I think this upcoming week, taking on the Detroit Lions, they're going to get back to that. Last season against the Detroit Lions in Week 4, a game in which it ended 48-45 as the total score, a shootout. DK Metcalf had himself 7 catches for 149 receiving yards. Again, the secondary of this defense has changed in terms of some of their personnel, but ultimately, if you want to find success against this defense, you're going to have to throw the ball, and Geno Smith's going to have to elevate his game in comparison to last week. Our number 16 for this week is DeAndre Hopkins. So here's the thing about DeAndre Hopkins. He has a matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers. Like I mentioned earlier, he does probably take on primary coverage from a guy like J.C. Jackson, if not him, Mike Davis. DeAndre Hopkins is an elite wide receiver. He had himself 13 targets within the overall 34 passing attempts. I mean, 30+% target share within this offense. Incredible. We just require that Ryan Tannehill just plays a little bit better. Ryan Tannehill was 16 of 34 passing and had himself 3 interceptions. I'm worried about Ryan Tannehill getting replaced, and that may lead to Malik Willis and or Will Levis. And I think that overall opportunity of targets is going to go down if in fact that's the case, because they'll want to potentially pass the ball less with less experienced quarterbacks. We got to hope that a guy like Ryan Tannehill can stay in the pocket, not turn over the ball, and be far more efficient than he was last week. Against the secondary that did not play well last week, I believe that DeAndre Hopkins, the lone primary wide receiver of this offense, should find himself a lot of success. Number 17 is Brandon Aiyuk. Now, even though I expect a lot of success from Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey this week, Brandon Aiyuk's performance cannot be ignored from last week. 8 catches, 129, 2 touchdowns. Obviously, they had themselves a little bit of a get back against Patrick Peterson and all the comments he had prior to the week. Now, besides Deebo Samuel finding success against this team, you go back to last season, week 8 against the Los Angeles Rams. Guess what Brandon Aiyuk did? 6 receptions, 81 and a touchdown, 17.1 fantasy points. The 49ers are 8-0 against the Los Angeles Rams in the regular season since 2019. And if Brandon Aiyuk is going to continue to maintain the number 1 receiving potential option of this offense, I'm expecting Brock Purdy, who throughout his entire career, 8 of his 9 overall games in which he's been healthy in, has consisted of 2 or more passing touchdowns. I'm hoping that potentially Brandon Aiyuk can come down with another touchdown in this contest. Number 18 is Mike Evans. I had no hope in Mike Evans, primarily because I didn't have much hope that Baker Mayfield would be able to elevate Mike Evans to a level in which we've seen only Tom Brady kind of get him to. Well, the fact of the matter was, 10 total targets. Overall, within that game, that's a 29.4% target share. Nearly 30% within this offense is incredible. 6 receptions, 66 receiving yards, had himself a touchdown, which obviously elevates his overall performance. They take on the Chicago Bears this week. It is one of the easiest matchups you can possibly ask for. We saw Jordan Love tear apart this defense without Christian Watson, and quite frankly, without Aaron Jones for half that game. Therefore, if we're going to see Baker Mayfield taking on this Chicago Bears defense, it should be a matchup that he can handle. And the last time Mike Evans took on this defense back in 2021, had himself 3 receiving touchdowns. Maybe the upside is not totally out of the realm of possibility in the given week. Number 19 is Amari Cooper. Now, Amari Cooper is purely dependent on whether or not Deshaun Watson can really show up. I mean, his last performance this last week was not what we expected. And yes, they got the victory, and that is the required result that they are looking for. But ultimately, only getting 3 receptions from Amari Cooper for fantasy purposes is brutal. Taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers this week, they have a great opportunity to bounce back. I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers secondary just got completely torched by Brandon Aiyuk. So if Amari Cooper and an elevated Deshaun Watson, who's not going to throw for a 50% passing completion percentage, can show up, I'm hoping that Amari Cooper can potentially put together a great performance. Last season, in the 2 games in which he took on Pittsburgh, with Jacoby Brissett, put up 19.6 fantasy points. And unfortunately, in week 18, with Deshaun Watson, only put up 6 fantasy points. I guess time will tell what kind of Amari Cooper we're going to have for the remainder of the year based on the performances of Deshaun Watson. Our number 20 for this week is T. Higgins. Now, I understand the man had 0 fantasy points off 0 receptions, but he also had 8 targets. So the opportunity, wasn't completely absent. It was just a matter of Joe Burrow coming back from the injury, not practicing throughout all of training camp, and just trying to play up against the defense that, quite honestly, really is tough. That pass rush got to him, and with this offensive line falling apart, putting on 10 quarterback hits and 2 sacks, it made a very difficult day for Joe Burrow. Nonetheless, T. Higgins should have himself a bounce back week along with the rest of this offense. You got to remember that having a 0-point fantasy week does not mean your season's over. You go back to last season, DeVonta Smith week 1, 0 fantasy points, still finished as a top 12 wide receiver by season's end. Now, the last time T. Higgins took on this defense in the wild card game throughout the playoffs against the Baltimore Ravens, 4 catches, 37 receiving yards, 7.7 fantasy points. We do expect that there's a potential in which Marlon Humphrey misses this game. If that's the case, Jamar Chase on the opposite side of the field, torching this defense is only going to open up more coverage for T. Higgins on the opposite side. We move on to Puka Nacua. Now, here's the thing. Puka Nacua is a rookie wide receiver, yes, but the volume of opportunity that he was given is an unbelievable number. 15 total targets in a debut game as a rookie is record-breaking. Not only that, 10 receptions and 119 receiving yards. These are numbers that, quite frankly, you're not going to see often. But considering he is filling into a role that is quite honestly void, which is Cooper Kupp within this offense. I mean, Cooper Kupp, the last 2 times he took on the 49ers last season, 19.2 fantasy points, 18.9 fantasy points, 14 catches on 19 targets, 122, 8 catches on 12 targets, 79. I'm not saying that Puka Nacua is the next coming of Cooper Kupp. I'm just saying the potential opportunity volume may in fact just be that number, primarily because the San Francisco 49ers defense is incredible at stopping the run. They're going to go ahead and lock down anything that Sean McVay would like to do in the running game. Therefore, it's going to force the pass. And with Puka Nacua pretty much playing out wide in the slot and very comfortable in doing that, should be the primary receiver and have himself a lot of opportunity in a game in which this offense is throwing for majority of the time. Number 22 is Michael Pittman Jr., another one of these players that I ranked very low last week, and I wasn't expecting much primarily because I didn't expect much from the quarterback. Anthony Richardson played significantly better than I anticipated, and even though they really built the offense to really help Anthony Richardson in the passing game, like Michael Pittman Jr., he had himself 8 receptions on 11 targets. 7 of those 8 receptions were between 0 to 9 yards down the field, and 6 of those 7 overall receptions were all made on the right side of the field. They are not really forcing a guy like Anthony Richardson to throw across his body. They're giving him all of the overall comfortable checkdowns close to the line of scrimmage. Therefore, it's giving a lot of value to Michael Pittman Jr., who in seasons past really has struggled because quarterbacks did not look in his direction often enough. Now, they do take on the Houston Texans last season in the 2 matchups against the Houston Texans. The first game, 9 catches, 121 and a touchdown, 22 plus fantasy points for Michael Pittman Jr. In week 18, the follow-up game, 3 catches, 30 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Again, without much help at the quarterback position, still relevant. Michael Pittman Jr., with Anthony Richardson hopefully healthy this week, should be a solid play. Number 23 is Tyler Lockett. Now, like I mentioned with DK Metcalf earlier, this offense fell apart very early. In the first drive of the game, Tyler Lockett had his only 2 receptions. Quite literally, his final reception was with 14 minutes and 12 seconds remaining in the first quarter. When you take that into consideration, in the fact that he was also evaluated for a concussion throughout that game, it does, kind of give me a little bit of relief as to, okay, Tyler Lockett wasn't all that bad. He was dealing with some stuff, and really the offense fell apart. Therefore, the entire game just got out of hand, and they let it go. That being the case, they have a huge opportunity in week 2 to redeem themselves against the Detroit Lions. Last season against the secondary, 6 catches for 91 receiving yards. I'm hoping Tyler Lockett is going to get himself far more utilization. Again, he was the primary receiver, caught the first 2 passes of the game immediately for 5 yards a pop, but then after that, obviously disappeared. Number 24 is Chris Godwin. I'm hoping for more utilization of Chris Godwin. Obviously, Baker Mayfield has proven that he is capable enough to get the job done, taking on the Chicago Bears, one of the worst secondaries in the National Football League. I'm expecting a huge game here. Primarily, Chris Godwin is one of these wide receivers that is going to get himself a high volume of overall receptions, hopefully yardage. In comparison, touchdowns are going to be difficult for him to find, but nonetheless, we did see Baker Mayfield complete 2 passing touchdowns, 1 to Mike Evans, 1 to Trey Palmer, the rookie wide receiver. If in fact one of those go in the direction of Chris Godwin, he'll be significantly better than the number 24 overall spot. This is just based off of receptions and receiving yards that he'll be able to accumulate within the matchup in the given week. Number 25 is DJ Moore. I'm going to give DJ Moore and this offense the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to say that Justin Fields' overall performance in week 1 does not speak volumes as to what we can potentially see in the future. I'm expecting that DJ Moore, especially going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he has had himself a lot of success in the past against that team as they were division rivals. He took on that defense twice a year. Specifically last season, in the 2 games against that defense, 7 catches, 69 and a touchdown for 16 fantasy points. And in the other game, week 17, 6 catches, 117 and a touchdown for 20.7 fantasy points. He has found a lot of success against that secondary. In terms of personnel, they're nearly identical. Therefore, we're in a potential week here in which DJ Moore can get himself back on track. Jair Alexander really did lock him down last week, but that really isn't much of a surprise. It's purely just up to Justin Fields getting the ball into the hands of his best receiver that they spent a lot of draft capital on trading for him this offseason. Number 26 is Zay Flowers, the rookie wide receiver. Zay Flowers was utilized in every sort of capacity. Besides the 10 overall targets and allowing him to run pretty much every route on the route tree, they also got himself 2 rushing attempts out of the backfield for 9 rushing yards. On top of it, had 4 red zone targets within that game. Those are huge numbers. And as we progress, as the clear and away number 1 wide receiver of this offense, considering OBJ and Rashad Bateman had very little target share, even with the return of Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers is going to be necessary in order to help this team find success against the Cincinnati Bengals in this given week. I'm expecting him to have himself another big game here with Lamar Jackson. Number 27 is Mike Williams. Now, the inconsistency of Mike Williams definitely did play a factor last week. He did leave the game and was evaluated for a concussion. He did end up returning, so he should have been fully healthy. Nonetheless, he did miss some time. Therefore, the 4 catches, 45 receiving yards against the Miami Dolphins, though it was underwhelming, he has a chance this week against the Tennessee Titans. They've given up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Last season against that defense, 4 catches, 67, wasn't the most promising given week, but I'm expecting a lot of passing attempts from Justin Herbert and a lot of potential upside from their receiving options. Number 28 is Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson's in a tough spot. With Zach Wilson last year in the 9 games in which they played together, he only averaged 6.71 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. Though he was able to haul in a touchdown on a very inaccurate pass, 11.9 fantasy points was made in that week 1 contest. Nonetheless, now you have to take on Stephon Gilmore and Stefon Diggs. It is not going to be an easy week for Zach Wilson. Hopefully, we'll give Garrett Wilson slant routes and a lot of close to the line of scrimmage potential passing attempts that can get him fantasy value, so that he can make plays after the catch and find himself more upside in that overall category. Number 29 is Christian Watson. My assumption is that Christian Watson plays this week and hopefully is going to be fully healthy. We obviously haven't seen him this year, but we know what kind of potential upside he has. Additionally, the performance from Jordan Love in this offense does give us hope that they are going to be on the right track. And taking on the Atlanta Falcons, this should be a great game for this team to once again prove that they are one of the best within the NFC North. Moving on. Let's talk about our number 30. We have Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk, though he had only 23 routes ran, and in comparison to Zay Jones, played far less overall snaps, they're really just utilizing him as their primary slot receiver. They don't have him as the number 2 receiving option within this offense in comparison to where they had him last season. With Calvin Ridley there now, it really does diminish the overall role of Christian Kirk, but I do want to go ahead and give him another shot this week because they do take on Kansas City. Last season, in week 10 against that defense, 9 catches, 105 and 2 touchdowns for 27 fantasy points. In the playoffs against that defense, 14 targets, 7 catches, 52 and a touchdown, 16.5 fantasy points. I'm hoping for more success here. We just saw Amon-Ra St. Brown from the slot position find a lot of success. Why not Christian Kirk? Moving on to Terry McLaurin, number 31. This is going to be a competitive matchup. The Denver Broncos taking on the Washington Commanders. I don't think there's a team between the two that is going to dominate the other. I think it's just going to be a matter of whether or not Terry McLaurin can find success against the secondary, specifically Patrick Surtain II. And I think that he can in those specific circumstances in which perhaps he's seeing more targets. Again, 4 targets, 2 receptions is just not enough to justify playing him on a given week. So we're going to hope that going into this given week, we'll see far more utilization within the position. Again, he did miss the last couple weeks of practice, so maybe Sam Howell doesn't have as much of a built rapport with him in comparison to some of these other receiving options like a Curtis Samuel, Logan Thomas, who saw a lot of potential upside in that game. But going forward, we're hoping for Terry McLaurin to get back on track in the given matchup. Number 32 is Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas, in comparison to, of course, Rashid Shaheed. Of course, Rashid Shaheed had himself more receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, a couple rushing attempts, but Michael Thomas has himself a built rapport already with Derek Carr. I mean, it was apparent. 5 catches on 8 targets, 61 receiving yards, and on top of it, had himself 3 total red zone targets, 2 of which were inside the 10-yard line, could have very easily led to a touchdown. I expect Rashid Shaheed and, of course, Chris Olave, who are great deep receiving threat options within this offense, to continue to open up coverage for a guy like Michael Thomas to find him success against the Carolina Panthers secondary. Moving on to Courtland Sutton. If, in fact, Jerry Jeudy does play this week and does return, he would immediately take over Courtland Sutton's overall ranking. And, in fact, I'd rank Jerry Jeudy even higher. The problem I have with Courtland Sutton is that Russell Wilson just doesn't like throwing him the ball. Courtland Sutton found all of his receiving statistics on quite literally one drive. Right before halftime, he got himself all 4 of his receptions, his 32 receiving yards, and his receiving touchdown. So with that being the case, with not a single reception in the second half, it leads me to believe that Russell Wilson just does not like to target him. And really, we saw that a lot last season. His favorite target is Jerry Jeudy. And if Jerry Jeudy returns going up against Washington, he's the guy I'm playing. Outside of that, don't really trust, Courtland Sutton outside of a situation where he's the primary number 1 within this offense. Number 34 is George Pickens. With Deontay Johnson gone, George Pickens is expected more workload. That being said, we did see Calvin Austin, 6 targets, 6 receptions. We did see a lot of target utilization go in the direction of Allen Robinson, the veteran wide receiver within that organization. Ultimately, the fact that both Calvin Austin and Allen Robinson both had just as many, if not more, receptions than George Pickens, who should be the elite wide receiver within this offense, is a little bit concerning, but I'm going to go ahead and just blame that on the overall matchup. We'll hope that going into the matchup against the Cleveland Browns, he'll find success. Week 18 of last season, 3 catches, 72 and a touchdown for 14.7 fantasy points. We're hoping for that kind of upside in the absence of Deontay Johnson. Moving on to our number 35, Jahan Dotson. Again, I'm not willing to give up on Jahan Dotson just yet. He does have upside. This offense will be in situations to score. We know that the number 2 wide receiver of the Las Vegas Raiders taking on Denver, Jacoby Myers, found himself a lot of success, scored 2 touchdowns, 9 catches, 80-plus receiving yards. Hopefully, Jahan Dotson can fill into that role, have himself a huge game, primarily because Damari Mathis, the overall number 2 cornerback of this defense, got torched by Jacoby Myers. We're hoping for Jahan Dotson to find himself similar success in the matchup. The final player I wanted to mention is Zay Jones. Yes, in fact, we have 3 wide receivers on the Jacksonville Jaguars on our rankings. Again, last season, against this defense in the 2 matchups, 10.8 fantasy points in both contests overall. With Christian Kirk only running 23 overall routes last week, and the fact that Zay Jones is clearly the number 2 in terms of overall snap counts, if the targets continue to go in his direction, the red zone opportunities will certainly be there and will unlock his overall potential in a game in which should be a shootout between these 2 top-tier AFC teams. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I appreciate you guys supporting the channel. If you guys have not yet already, of course, subscribe, click the like button down below. Let me know down in the comment section, are there any players that you believe should be in the top 36 rankings going into this week that you believe I have not ranked high enough? Potentially a Jordan Addison going into the Thursday Night Football game. Potentially Nico Collins taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Let me know down in the comment section. I do appreciate y'all. Again, if you guys want my continuous rankings for every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the 2023 season, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. Make that first time deposit minimum of $10. You'll get my rankings every single week for the remainder of the season, every Sunday morning. My email to yours. Be sure to check your spam folder. That's it. Until tomorrow, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.